Welcome to Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
And we talk about punk music, culture, but not in the way you would expect. We're using all things punk as a way to learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. As a reminder, we are creating distinctive groupings just to reflect on human experience and self-discovery. Our groupings are not meant to be definitive, all-inclusive categories, but to simply give us a shared frame of reference to articulate concepts. So today, we are talking about a topic that we are not necessarily excited about, and not because we are in love with the topic the way I was about Riot Girl, or as you are about Rancid, Matt.
Yeah. This one's
a bit more complicated.
Yeah, totally.
So with that, let's hand it to you. What are we talking about today? And launch us into that brief history lesson from our resident historist.
Yeah, so we'll give you a history lesson of the scene, but today we're talking about a person more than anybody else. We're talking about Scott Sturgeon, frontman for Leftover Crack, Star Fucking Hipsters, and Choking Victim. Coming out of a scene, though, that I think everybody who grew up in the 90s knows about. It's the hardcore ska, ska-core, ska punk. It goes by very, many names out there on the internet and, whatever record store you go into, I'm sure it's got something else. But we're going to really focus on one person. But before we can do that, let's check out the scene real quick. And specifically, let's get into ska-core, as I think we can refer to it as, and then we'll get into the subgenre later of crackcore, which is Leftover Crack, Scott Sturgeon's baby in and of itself. So ska-core, which is a subgenre of ska, comes into being in the 1980s, first in like New York with bands like the Toasters, but then you've also got this infusion of some folks out in your neck of the woods, the Mighty Bosstones, who start playing with some of the more metal, hardcore elements, and ska itself, creating something very distinct ska-core sound with all the horns and everything else. And then out in California, you got bands like Operation Ivy, who drop the horns but keep the melodic, up-tempo nature of ska, but are infusing a much more punk rock sort of ska sound. And as this sound develops through the 80s and gets into the 90s, it starts picking up other groups that are familiar because they were big-time breakthrough successes. Bands like Sublime and No Doubt come to mind as they kind of pick up where Operation Ivy leaves off. Of course, Operation Ivy members Tim Armstrong and Matt Freeman will reform Rancid, and they will create a sound very similar as well. And then you also have these bands around the periphery that don't necessarily have the huge breakthrough success, but still carry forth the sound. Thinking about like out of Detroit, the Suicide Machines out of Florida, Against All Authority, and all that sort of stuff.
I have one to add.
Oh.
I don't think I've even told you this before. Out of Maine, Rustic Overtones.
Ooh.
I can't tell you even how many shows I went to as a kid. They were Maine's resident ska band back in the day. So shout out to Rustic Overtones.
There you go. See, and all the cities, all the scenes all across the country, they all have their own local guys who pick up. This was a really popular genre of punk rock music during the mid 90s and into the late 90s. And then, of course, our band or person that we're focusing on, the first of many projects that he does, Scott Sturgeon, or aka Stza Crack, is Choking Victim, which eventually breaks up and then reforms as Leftover Crack, something that does not exist, a little play on words. And then through the 2000s into the the aughts, and then the teens, he has a side project, Star Fucking Hipsters, as well. And what all these bands have in common is this really upbeat tonality, these really hyper politicized sort of lyrics. And then, whether or not they're playing with the horn section, they still have the up-tempo, upbeat nature of ska. So this whole scene, widely popular during the 1990s, and I think for a lot of people becomes an entryway into punk. I know it was for me. The first time I got
Mhm.
exposed to bands like Suicide Machines was in the mid '90s when I was in middle school, and so sometimes it gets flagged with this like entry level punk sort of label. Which I don't know. I think as we get into it today, regardless of whether or not it's hardcore and it's underground and it's deep cut sort of punk, it's still important because a lot of these bands had important things to say. So that's just kind of the basic nature of the scene and who's there. But like I said, we're here to talk about a person within the scene more than anything else. And that person again is Scott Sturgeon, aka Stza Crack, fronting Choking Victim, Leftover Crack, and Star Fucking Hipsters.
Yeah, even as you start to lead us into this, I find my heart rate rising a little bit and getting a little anxious because we are talking about a person who is complicated in the scene. And it's such an interesting contrast with the upbeat, cheerful nature of this scene that brought us, both of us and many of us, into the punk scene, and how complicated Scott Sturgeon is and all of his personas, and these two extraordinarily influential bands that he is inextricably linked to. And there are some other older school punk bands that had these sort of similar issues or similar challenges. Sex Pistols,
Mhm.
of these stories of can't let them into um radio interviews because they're going to be destroying equipment or even throwing up on equipment, right? But this
Purposefully.
guy in particular takes it to a whole nother level.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, and we talked about this idea of like in your face punk and gaining attention, getting eyes on you in a way that's supposed to create some sort of transformative change in message. When we talked about Riot Girl previously, and what Kathleen Hanna was very purposefully doing in this reclamation of self, and punk has had all the way back to the beginning this adopted persona of transgression and combativeness. And whether it's the Nazi iconography that we've talked about previously, or the names of certain bands like Joy Division, for example, who I know is not necessarily a punk band, but still they're playing out there with this Nazi name and symbolism. You've got the Ramones and I'm a Nazi, Shotzi baby, all this sort of stuff. Like this is very transgressive. It's in your face, and it's meant to piss off people, specifically in the 1970s and early 1980s, who fought World War II. And so there's this element of like gaining people's attention through offense and then doing something with that. And then there's what Scott Sturgeon and Leftover Crack are all about, which is like, let's just get into it. This squat slum lifestyle animated by musical lyrics and imagery that celebrate hardcore drug use, and a lifestyle that is supposed to be outside of the societal norm. And as you sort of delve into what Sturgeon and the bands that he's fronting are talking about, you start to get this political message, this economic message, and the social message that's supposed to make you think. However, there's something here that feels missing that wasn't so with especially the Riot Girl stuff, but also the early utilization of Nazi imagery that early punk played with. It just feels a little bit different.
Yeah, before we get into why we're really talking about this, will you give us a little more um, taste of why Scott Sturgeon is distasteful?
Yeah. So, all right, where to start? So, Sturgeon in his biography, when he talks about growing up, he leaves home at an early age. He kind of rides the rails. He does the whole like hobo sort of lifestyle. It's in this early formative teenage experience that he starts doing drugs, specifically smoking crack, and then later heroin use. Something that he will celebrate through his music and in interviews, and it makes a core foundational piece of his public image and his lifestyle, according to him. He, very purposely draws attention to like living on the streets and in squats, and something that we talked about when we talked about the Agnostic Front and Roger Merritt. But there, this element of him where he's like on the outside is then like kind of like leveled up by this like celebration of like, hey, and by the way, I am covered in fleas and I have scabies and just this like sort of stuff that like very purposefully, like I just, we're not a visual podcast, but you cringed when
I
I said that.
literally, ugh.
Yeah, and I would say like Surgeon might say, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. Like that's the point. Like, all right, now you see me. Now I've got your attention. Now here are the things that I have to say. And like, my aesthetic is this rejection of your society and your worlds and your economy and all this sort of stuff. But it just kind of rings his aesthetic rings somewhat, I don't want to say hollow, but it's like it's so over the top as a persona that it makes you kind of like it's almost comical in a way that like maybe a good analogy would be for like the 60s hippies movement of like people who like get way into like Maoism and like I reject all things bourgeois, including like everybody in the commune needs to have one toothbrush, right? And you just like hear stuff like that and you laugh because you're like, that's ridiculous, right? And Sturgeon's the same way of like, hey man, like you got to take me more seriously because I'm covered in fleas. And like, do I? Or can I just listen to your music instead? Like, I don't know. So this is the person we are dealing with. And I think the thing we also have to acknowledge right off the top with him is he also, after, in the late teens, starts to deal with accusations of battery, violence towards women. Specifically, there is a accusation made against him of violence by Whitney Flynn, who talks about beatings and vicious attacks by Sturgeon. There's stories about him going back to the early 90s, getting beat up in the scene and fighting people and this really sort of violent outburst behavior that dogs him everywhere he goes. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of the last straw for him is this piece of like, maybe I'm not here for the crack, and maybe I'm not here for the heroin. I'm definitely not here for the fleas and the scabies. But like the violence towards women, the violence towards other people, like that's that final bridge too far. At the same time, we're talking about him and his bands because for a lot of people, the things that, especially to me, Choking Victim we're talking about was a doorway into politics and society that just didn't have access to when you were young. I know for me that was the case. I didn't grow up in a community or a household that had anything leftist, anything other than like this very normative, traditional American sort of conservatism. And listening to bands like Choking Victim opened up my eyes in a way that like makes it really hard to want to let some of that stuff go as well, to just be perfectly frank.
Yeah, and I think that gets to really why we're covering this here, and we talked at length about do we really want to go down this road, and we avoided our preliminary conversations, our discovery around what this might mean, bringing into this specific podcast sphere. There are other people that cover this much more thoroughly, so we're gonna sort of leave this recap of history and context there. You can check out in the show notes if you want to learn more about this
Totally.
ugh, creepy character. The question that plagues us is does Crackcore, does this deep transgression need to exist in order for other more things that we would like to think from our point of view are more tasteful in order to exist and more evolved maybe even. And even evolved is depending on what eyes you look at it through. Sturgeon's eyes tell him he is the evolved beings and the rest of us are off track. Yes, we're laughing because we find that hard to digest.
I mean, yeah, they have this like E side and F side album comp, and this other one called Leftover Crack, and the cover of that is like a bloated louse that's like full of blood. They're very clearly like playing with this sort of stuff, but like, yeah, no, I get your point of this idea of Um, if art is supposed to hold a mirror up to society and reflect it back, is this something that's purposeful? Is there something here worth exploring, or is this kind of just like the flailing teenage meltdown that never ends for Sturgeon,
Mhm.
and we're left with trying to parse through, is there something here or is there not?
Yeah, and maybe even a step beyond purposeful. Is it maybe in some senses necessary?
Mm.
We may not answer that today, but we're gonna play with this space here of is there? I would posit that there are. Spoiler alert. Are there things we can learn from this? What can, even if it's distasteful to us and many others, we're not in the minority here. The music might be enjoyable, the character might be distasteful, but are there what, if anything, is there that we can learn from this? So, again, we're gonna spare you hours and hours of discussion that we've had about this, the long meandering conversation. We're gonna do our best to be concise, although neither of us are very concise people. Um, but I think it's important here to start with some of these tension points that we've alluded to that we wanna grapple with. And this first idea of, like, fun music, terrible people. What do we do with it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we'll have a playlist put together for this band because I think it's something you do need to hear to kind of really understand what this band is doing and talking about and the juxtaposition of Sturgeon, the person, and the band and the scene and everything else. But like for example, the opening album that he has, full length album, No Gods, No Managers, like that is a punk rock classic. Extremely well received within the scene. There are people, Jesse Michaels from Operation Ivy, one of the progenitors of this, talks about like this like kind of visionary artist that is Sturgeon, somebody who understands like pop and punk and black metal, and he can fuse all these things together in a way that is just like really enjoyable. And there's something to like when you're making this type of music outside our art, as it were. Daniel Booth from Melody Maker, when he reviewed our album in 1999 when it came out, he said, "quote It's like the sound of 1,000 dung beagles gargling their own shit." Right, and he gave it 0 stars, which like I just love that because like I feel like Sturgeon in particular would be like, yes, that's what I was going for. I win, you lose. Um, but yeah, I mean, you have this really, really good stuff, but at the same time, you have this band that, you know, is also bringing forth a message. That album in particular features Michael Parenti, who's a political leftist who has speeches and talks and lectures that are spliced into that album all throughout. And for me, like I talked about earlier, there was this political education here that was something I could not get literally anywhere else. It's just like in your face, these little, snippets of 30 seconds, 45 seconds that build to or lead to a song. They're topically oriented. And there was something really neat there, that, young or old, that you can still go back and listen to. And it's like, it just hits really, really well.
Yeah, it makes me think here as we bring in this personal development piece, coaching piece, whatever you want to call it, is this intent and impact. So Sturgeon's intent is more of that thousand dung beetles. He's wanting to disrupt and kind of be gross for the sake of being gross and destructive for the sake of being destructive. And at the same time, the impact on little Matt was an awakening. So even though it came from this place that we're positing is kind of not of the highest moral structure or the greatest intent, yet the impact is sort of revolutionary and is essential to the fabric of the human you've become and started your journey into punk music, lifelong love and obsession. Um, and so it's interesting here, and we grapple with this often, intent and impact. Oftentimes we think of it as, well, I had a good intent, even if the impact on someone isn't as good. In this case, we're seeing it kind of on the opposite end of the intent the intent from Sturgeon is, make money, get famous, destruct things. But the impact is valuable, and not just on young Matt, on a generation of young people. And so we get into this like complicated piece, and it feeds more into this question of separating art from artist.
Mhm.
And we talked about this in the last episode around once the art is created, it's actually out there for the world, for the consumer to consume as they wish. But by consuming this, we're condoning in some way the Sturgeon's lifestyle
Right.
and the things that he is doing. And live and let live. If you're not harming others, I guess go hang out with your fleas by yourself. You're not invited to my house for dinner. But if you're harming other people, which is part of his story, um, then we get into another more complicated situation. So, not that we're going to resolve it here, but it is an important note around something we often deal with as people is like, but my intent was good.
Right.
And that's all good and well, but how does it land in the greater world actually matters too. Road to hell is paved with good intentions, sort of the opposite here. But
Right.
it gives us that opportunity to talk about intent and impact, how they are different, and they may not always be different in the way we think they will be.
Totally. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting there is that especially when you think about Scott Sturgeon, is like his intent of being this outsider of holding the mirror up, like we've already said, that's there. But then he also, like, I think this is where a lot of the criticism of the band and the band being Leftover Crack now more than Choking Victim, they break up '99 and then reform with a handful of the members in early 2000 and signed to Hellcat and all this other stuff. Doesn't matter. The person that Scott Sturgeon is rife with contradictions. And I think that also
Mhm.
is a layer of this onion that we have to peel back to kind of understand what's going on here. So not only is Sturgeon doing this anti-capitalism thing and this trying to piss you off on purpose, transgression sort of thing, but then at the same time he's also kind of moralizing and he's acting in a way that like he's calling out other people, but he not at the same time is he willing to be receptive to criticism either. He's this really it's almost an immature sort of stance that most people tend to age out of, and yet, like, Sturgeon continuously, whenever, somebody wants to criticize him, he has a really hard time dealing with that criticism, and there's this lack of self-awareness that, like, really calls into question that authenticity.
Yeah, and it's a great point here. It's and why I think it's really important that we ourselves, examine ourselves on the inside, and sometimes examine the actions that come from who we are on the inside and how they show up in the world, not to self-flagellate or to put ourselves down or to berate ourselves or even conform, but the uninspected life, the life that where you are not looking on the inside and you are just looking on the outside, leads to this sort of immaturity by which you are too fragile to take critique or criticism, or too fragile to even consider the fact that you may need to evolve in some way. And what is human life if not an evolutionary process? We are in different phases and shades and times of life. We need to, if we don't mature internally along those, then we have limited tools by which to pull from and mm, act appropriately. Not that we should be age appropriate and that you should do some sort of conformity dance, but if you don't continue along a maturation process for the educational geeks out there like Matt and I, Eric Erickson's work around the moral dilemmas that we are meant to go through over our entire lives. If we get stuck in one of those moral dilemmas and never actually mature, we can't really make age appropriate decisions within our own preferred life or lifestyle. I think that's what we're seeing with Sturgeon here. Now, for many of us, we do mature, but we get into these places where we're sort of fearful of what we're really going to uncover in ourselves. Like, if I find this part of me that is maybe a little less tasteful, like this part of me, if I find it that I don't like as much, does that make me
Mhm.
completely a bad person? Am I all like, oh, now I'm no good, or I'm somehow damaged? Um, but really, what is the truth and sort of counterintuitive is by examining those bits and pieces of yourself, you can actually be more whole and accepting of the parts of you that are less tasteful than others. I was actually just talking about this with my own coach recently that it was a pattern for myself to hide away the shadow side parts of myself, the parts of myself that I didn't like as much. It took me a while to really get used to this idea of taking those parts of me out and examining them and recognizing that, yes, they do have good qualities when they're kept in check with my other qualities. But if I ignore them, if I leave them alone, or not if I leave them alone, but if I ignore them and I hide them away from myself. So I sometimes say like the parts of yourself that you least want to see, you've hidden back behind your kidneys because you couldn't possibly see them if you tried. The problem with taking those parts of ourselves that we don't like and by balling them up and hiding them away from yourself is that they do need attention too. And if they don't get attention, they get kind of irritated and fired up. And all it takes is one tiny little poke from the right trigger, and that part of you will rear up and show up and act out. And oftentimes, it's almost like after that happens, you stop and you go, whoa, who just took over in my head? Where did that come from? That was not me. Well, it was you. It was a part of you that was undertended to. It's not integrated into your being in your life. So it just shows up and takes over when it gets this full force because it's been triggered. And Sturgeon is sort of one big
Yes.
trigger. He hasn't integrated he maybe hasn't integrated the higher quality parts of
Totally. I think he's a
himself.
bundle of contradictions and sometimes in the worst way. I mean, like here's a person who's willing to, through his music and interviews, call out like reggae for it being this misogynist scene. And then at the same time, he is very clearly a misogynistic personality who will take that to a violent level. He calls out capitalism and consumerism. And then in an interview he does with Vice magazine at that time, he's at a restaurant plowing through a seafood platter that like the author of the article can't help but notice is like this persona that you affect and this person that I see here in front of me in this like Michelin starred restaurant or whatever with butter dripping down your chin, like it's not there. Like he's just this ball of contradiction. In that article, he has a quote about like one of the key tropes in his music, which is violence towards police officers and cop killing, where he says, quote, "I'm not so militant that I think every cop should be killed, but I think that in order to affect change, you have to have extremist art and extremist positions in art, like people talking about killing cops." Like all of this is this like, yeah, I don't know. There's a philosopher. I don't know if you're familiar with him. His name is Aaron James, and he wrote this book called Assholes, a Theory. And basically, his premise in the book is that assholes are just people who think that the rules exist, they just don't apply to them. And like Sturgeon seems to encapsulate this perfectly in a way that like you just talked about. Like if you don't reconcile yourself with yourself, if you don't see the parts of who you are, this is what you end up being, right? Yeah, like the non-critical, non-coaching term, you're just an asshole now. And that's what he seems to be in a lot of ways, musically, for sure. And then he can't deal with this piece of being called out. But like being an asshole is not really the point, is it? Right? I don't know. There's more there to it.
Yeah, and there are other shades of that besides assholery.
Nice word.
That is one. But there's others. There's the people who are overly tender and sensitive, so you can't give them feedback because they will fall apart and unravel, and they can't pick themselves back up. And there are or the person who's so just cold and guarded that you'll give them feedback, but they're just gonna deflect it
Mhm.
away.
Yeah.
So there's many, many ways that this shows up, and it's all essentially fragility.
Yes.
fragility because you've hidden away from yourself the things that are complicated about you, and you don't want to see them. So when somebody points them out, they're too fragile for you to be able to handle. And I think Sturgeon is, um, once we get past the imagery stuck in my head, I actually see him as this pretty fragile little boy,
Yeah, totally.
um, who who unfortunately is kind of stuck in this fragile little boyhood.
Yes, I think so. I think a story that kinda, um, animates that is, when his band Leftover Crack gets signed to Hellcat Records, they wanna, their next follow-up album after, the No Gods, No Managers that we talked about, initially is gonna be named Shoot the Kids at School, and on the album cover is supposed to be a picture of Sturgeon's arm holding a gun, targeting these kids. It's 2001. It's right after Columbine. Hellcat Records, Tim Armstrong, Brett Gurewitz, who's with Epitaph, the parent of the label. All these guys are like, absolutely not. We're not putting that out there. That cannot be. And Sturgeon comes back and he's like, why? And they're like, it's distasteful, it's exploitative, it's all these things that we don't believe in. And Sturgeon says like, well, you guys released a Lars Fredrickson and the Bastards album that's exploitative. It's got Lars on the cover with these two, I think they're strippers, sex workers, women who are, topless, and with some strategically placed stars. And Sturgeon's like, well, why is it okay to have this album cover and not this other album cover? Why do I have to change the name of the album? And they just say like, read the room, essentially, right?
Okay.
And he comes back and is like, fine. So it's just the album cover is just a picture of the band playing a basement gig, essentially. And the name of the album is retitled to be Mediocre Generica. And all of that just reeks of this childishness, this failure to grow and move past things. The tantrum and the pointing out of like, well, you let these guys do this thing and I can't do my thing. There's a double standard, there's censorship here, all this other stuff. It's just like, well, what's the point of naming the album Shoot the Kids at School? What's the point of the cover? Why? What purpose is this serving? What are you doing here that's adding to the conversation?
Yeah, this is a common trap of the underdeveloped self, as we're talking about it here, the maturation that doesn't follow the bodysuit or the skin suit, as one of my mentors calls it.
I like that.
I like it a lot too. It's a little bit gross, but like a little bit fun. Uh, but context really matters. And when you get stuck in a younger form of development, you stay in this black and white. And yet there's a whole spectrum here, and context matters. So let's put it in really simple terms that most of us can agree with. There are speed limits. Maybe we don't all follow them all the time, but we try to like not go too much over them most of the time. But let's say that your partner is having a heart attack. You're gonna drive faster.
Right.
Context matters. And if you get pulled over and you say to a cop they're having a heart attack, that cop's gonna go in front of you and lead the way most of the time to get you to the hospital. Context matters. The speed limit is about most cases, but there are exceptions that transcend the rule, shall we say. And in this case, when I hear this from Sturgeon, he's so delicate that all he can do is say, well, any slope is a slippery slope.
Right.
And that's not true. We know that there are shades from black to white. There are shades of gray in there, or from light to dark. There are shades in there. And the person who is stuck in that place just comes back to what is the one rule? What is the black and white? I'm going to follow it. Now, what is particularly interesting here is that as we talk about time and time again, punk is if there's one ethos of punk is that there are no rules, but then again, there are rules.
Yeah, totally. What you just said, yeah, totally. All that just makes me think of this band. We've seen them, a local band in the scene, the Spells. And I was at a show last fall, and the lead singer brings up this idea of being an asshole is a tool. It's not the point. right? Like, yes, you're going to do these things, but you're going to drop people in. You better be, like you said, driving the speed limit or whatever. Like, there better be a reason behind this sort of stuff, because if not, what are we doing here?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point here that and I think it's important to pause and put a finer point on that, is that acting from a place of intention is very different than acting from a place of reaction.
Hmm.
And the reaction comes from poking that tender, fragile thing that you didn't want to see, and then you react, versus the intention of being an asshole in this point, this or at this time is one tool. It's not the only tool, but I can use it as a tool when I've done enough work on myself that I can understand how to use it with intention, not just react or overreact. And it also takes us to um, if you just become an asshole for the sake of becoming an asshole, then there's this whole embodiment. It's the the more you surround yourself with something, the more you become that thing. So you think about, we often say it in a different context, but fake it till you make it,
Right.
right? Like you're learning something new, you don't have it mastered, you got to kind of fake it till you make it. Well, eventually you become it.
Right. Yeah,
And
totally.
if you're faking the assholery, at some point, if you're not doing it with intention and you're not doing it by reconciling it with other parts and pieces of yourself, shout out to the parts work, the IFS work of Richard Swartz and his team. If you're not bringing in all the parts of yourself, then the asshole becomes who you are, and all the other parts of you get hidden away into these little tiny pockets within yourself, and you don't really get to be the fullest expression of who you are.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like how Kathleen Hanna can be this ball of contradictions, and she's moving forward. She's moving towards something for herself, for her scene, for her music that can reconcile all those contradictions, because she is very present in everything that she's doing, versus Sturgeon, who seems to have lost the thread. Right? He doesn't. I don't think he can see the connections between his lifestyle, his music, the lyrical content, the scene, everything else, his politics, in a way that makes sense for him. I think he's just out there. There's this very strong difference between like that performative good asshole sort of stuff of the late 80s and 90s, and what Sturgeon's doing, which lacks self-awareness, to say the least.
Yeah, if you think about that iconic image of Kathleen Hanna in a tense moment with a male at one of her shows, folks can go look it up. It's super iconic. It's out there, black and white, really striking photo. You could look at that standalone and you could call her what we call the female equivalent of being an asshole. You could
Hmm.
say she looks like a bitch.
Right.
You could say that, right? I would argue pictures are worth 1,000 words, but context is worth maybe 1,000,000. What we know about that context is that that was a male aggressor, and she was escalating to de-escalate. She was sort of matching to then bring it down. That's actually a tool that we as educators use, social workers use, we coaches use. Sometimes we meet people's energy so they know that we get them, so we can create this relational fabric, this connection with one another, to then de-escalate. And she's for the context of this, maybe using a little bit of assholery or bitchery as a tool to connect with another human to further a cause, versus this other idea of like just to be an asshole is, we would argue in the sake of this conversation, counterproductive.
Yeah, totally. So as we kind of start bringing this thing towards a close, I'm struck with, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, because you don't have the same connection to, choking victim, leftover crack, this sort of stuff that I do. Once you know about Sturgeon, once you know about who he is, his past, his present, what he has done, is should we? It's not. It is. It's a should. Should we essentially cancel him? Should we leave that what he's done behind and say like, hey, there's too much transgression here. There's a lack of self-awareness. There's a lack of apology. There's a lack of growth. Therefore, we're not going to consume the art anymore. We're not going to consume the message anymore. Or do we try to divide art and artists here in a way that allows us to learn and grow and appreciate that which he's created, which again, many people within the punk world will say unapologetically, like there was something really there with what he's done. You can't have the number of collaborators and records and stuff that he's been able to put out and have nothing musically. But is this worth saving? Or is he an asshole in a way that is just unforgivable and we should move on? So I'm curious where you're at with that.
Well, I am glad that I am not the official police, judge, jury, and executioner
Yeah,
here.
Yeah,
I
totally
am
put you
so
on the
glad that
spot.
I am not any role where I make this sort of I don't have the impact that would allow this. And also, hey, as Matt said, I cringed many times throughout this, and I've cringed through our conversations, and I've had my stomach upset about some of this at times. It's just so distasteful. And as a person that identifies as a woman, has lived in a woman's body, once a girl's body, my whole life, and has experienced life as a woman and a girl, left to my own gut reactions and devices, I'd be like, throw this guy out of the tribe. Like, he's not here anymore. Get him out. Throw him out of the bar. I don't want him here. He doesn't belong in this show. And as we talked about last week, a band that I very much admire that's local here, Teaming Non-Existent, they think it's important to play that role to keep their community safe, and I admire that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and that's within the punk tradition, right?
Yeah.
It's Jello Biafra and Dead Kennedys and Nazi punks fuck off and all of that stuff. Like that's well within the tradition of this scene as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the tradition of the scene, with that being true, like my gut says, get this guy the hell out of here. Um, my belief as a coach and a person who works on personal development is that you need the dark to have the light.
Mhm.
You need some very small minority of distasteful figures to have other things out of it, multidimensional other things. Um, and so I think there's a kept in check. We throw him out of the show, we throw him out of the bar, maybe not the whole scene. And it gets complicated because if you liken it to recovery and what we covered in Tim Armstrong, like the rejection helped him
Mhm.
grow.
Yeah.
So some rejection is good for us, but sometimes rejection isn't, and it's overly complicated. So I think we come to where we were last week
Yes.
in a different way. Is that we don't really have an answer, but maybe there's something in between.
Right.
He's thrown out of the bar, but not out of the scene. And maybe we buy less of his music. Maybe we tone it down. He is such a minority voice. It's not like he's taken over all of punk in a particular way. And as you brought up another time when we were talking, there are ways to be transgressive that aren't always crazy palatable, but are steps easier up the scale to embrace than others.
Right.
And you were speaking of like sort of as Fat Mike from NoFX talks about in his biography, he has taken maybe a little bit of more of a transgressive journey in his life. He went a little more from good boy to a little bit more of a bad boy, whereas another band member, right, made a different path. Yet they're still in the same sort of space in the spectrum and haven't gone as far. So maybe that's where we land on this, that we're throwing him out of the bar, but not out of the
All
scene.
right, I like that. I like that. Yeah, we don't have to rehab him, but there's something there.
Yeah. And maybe more interventions would do him good. I don't know.
Seems like it. Maybe just some soap, some Dawn.
Maybe some
I
soap.
don't know. Also, I don't know. I don't even know how dirty he is. I don't know. I've never met the guy. What can I say?
Yeah. And that's a great point. We're also, right, as a disclaimer in the beginning, it's a great place to bring it back here. We're not really trying to tell Scissa's life story. We're not trying to say we're definitive on him. We're kind of using him as a character, is how he has been portrayed. He's portrayed himself and others have portrayed him as a way to think about these complicated topics, this spectrum of ways of being, and what we can learn from punk music, punk culture, punk characters, whatever they may be. And I think while we don't definitively know the ins and outs, it's allowed us to really examine some things that we can think about related to ourselves, related to other people that are in our lives. And maybe we don't have to cancel folks. Maybe there's a way that we can, for lack of a better word, police ourselves and each other with a gentler hand, with not just yes or no, you're in the club or you're in the scene or you're out of the scene, but maybe there are more shades that we can take from this that we don't often think. We often think it's like all or nothing.
Totally. Well said. I like that.
Well, thank you, Matt. I
Yeah, totally.
appreciate
Stamp of approval.
that. I appreciate it. So to really, really understand what we're talking about here, we want you to hear the music. So check out our Spotify playlist. As Matt said earlier, it'll be linked in the show notes. And with that, unless you have anything else.
No. Thanks for another great conversation.
All right. Well, that is the end of today's conversation on transgressive punk, or as we are calling it, Crackcore. Thanks for listening to our musings on Rogue Frequencies.